They told us it was accidental. They said it was history. They promised progress if we were patient, if we behaved, if we voted, if we waited our turn. But what if none of this is random? What if black oppression is not a failure of the system, but the purpose of it? In this rarely discussed interview, Minister Louis Farrakhan presents a perspective that challenges everything we have been taught to accept. He argues that the conditions facing black communities today, economic struggle, political marginalization, cuticle mind, nearby, fractured neighborhoods, and endless dependence are not the result of bad luck or individual mistakes. They are the outcome of systems carefully designed to produce exactly these results. Not chaos but control. Not neglect but strategy. From education to media, from policing to economics, Farrakhan suggests that power does not operate loudly. It operates quietly, structurally, invisibly shaping outcomes while convincing people that nothing could be changed. The most effective system, he argues, is one that makes people blame themselves while never questioning the machinery around them. This story is not about anger. It is about awareness. Because once you recognize that division is manufactured, dependence is encouraged, and political weakness is profitable, a new question emerges, one far more dangerous than protest. What happens when people stop asking for permission and start building for themselves? That is where this conversation begins. Not with slogans, not with surface-level debates, but with a deeper examination of power, design, and the uncomfortable truth about who benefits when a people remain divided. If you are ready to hear perspectives rarely amplified, to explore ideas that challenge official narratives, and to engage with history, culture, and power through an unfiltered lens, this channel is for you. Like this video if you believe conversations like this matter. Subscribe to stay connected to stories they do not want remembered and ideas they hope you will never question. Let us begin. Once you accept that oppression is not accidental, the next layer becomes impossible to ignore. Farrakhan does not describe a single enemy or a lone institution acting in isolation. Instead, he points to something far more subtle and far more powerful: a network. Government, media, banking, education, and policing, in his view, do not operate as separate forces competing for control. They function as parts of the same body, reinforcing one another in ways that appear ordinary on the surface, but produce remarkably consistent outcomes beneath it. Consider how early the pattern begins. Education is often presented as the great equalizer, yet Farrakhan argues that what is taught, what is excluded, and how potential is measured quietly shapes expectations long before adulthood. When children are trained to see success as something that must be granted by external approval rather than built through collective strength, ambition becomes narrow and self-contained. The system does not need to crush dreams outright. It only needs to redirect them away from independence and toward permission. Media then steps in to frame the story. It highlights certain narratives while burying others, repeatedly showcasing struggle without context and conflict without cause. Over time, this repetition conditions the public to see inequality as natural, inevitable, or self-inflicted. Progress, when it appears, is treated as an exception rather than evidence of capability. Farrakhan suggests that this is not simply about misrepresentation, but about narrative management, ensuring that any challenge to the existing order appears dangerous, unrealistic, or isolated. The economic layer tightens the structure even further. Banks and financial systems promise opportunity while quietly controlling access to it. Credit, investment, and capital flow easily toward established power, but become restricted, conditional, or temporary when communities attempt to build something lasting of their own. According to Farrakhan's analysis, wealth is not merely accumulated. It is guided. When economic independence starts to take shape, pressure follows in more discrete forms: policy changes, sudden regulations, withdrawn support actions that look procedural but function as barriers. Policing, in this framework, is not simply about law enforcement, but about maintaining boundaries. Farrakhan draws a distinction between protection and control, arguing that systems designed to preserve order often prioritize stability over justice. When economic or political strength begins to grow in marginalized communities, surveillance increases, tolerance narrows, and mistakes are punished more harshly. The message becomes clear without being stated. Growth is allowed only up to the point where it no longer threatens the balance of power. What makes this structure so effective, Farrakhan argues, is that each part appears independent and reasonable on its own. Education claims neutrality, media claims objectivity, finance claims risk management, policing claims safety, and government claims order. Yet together, they produce the same result again and again. Progress that challenges dependence is slowed, redirected, or quietly dismantled, not through dramatic confrontation, but through coordinated restraint. This is why Farrakhan insists that the issue is not a lack of effort or talent, but a system that responds defensively whenever empowerment becomes real. He frames this not as a theory of chaos, but as a pattern of preservation. Power protects itself, not through force alone, but through alignment. And as long as each institution reinforces the limits set by the others, the structure holds, appearing normal, lawful, and even benevolent. Within this understanding, the question shifts. It is no longer about why progress is so difficult, but why it is consistently interrupted at the same stage. Farrakhan's message suggests that the moment economic confidence, social cohesion, and political awareness begin to converge, resistance appears, not as a single wall, but as a closing circle. Recognizing that pattern, he argues, is the first step toward understanding how deeply connected the system truly is, and why meaningful change has always required more than participation within its boundaries. Once the system is seen as coordinated rather than fragmented, Farrakhan takes the argument one step further, reframing black neighborhoods not as neglected spaces, but as modern colonies operating within the borders of a powerful nation. In this telling, the similarities are not symbolic or exaggerated. They are structural. A colony is defined by external control when decisions about land, resources, education, security, and economics are made by people who do not live with the consequences. Farrakhan argues that this dynamic never disappeared. It simply changed its language and its uniforms. In a traditional colony, the purpose of authority is not to nurture growth but to maintain order. Stability matters more than well-being, and compliance matters more than dignity. Farrakhan suggests that this same logic governs the relationship between policing and black communities today. Safety, as it is commonly defined, does not begin with the lives of residents, but with the protection of property, infrastructure, and the existing hierarchy. When tension rises, the response is not rooted in care or understanding, but in containment. He points out that policing in this context is not primarily reactive, but preventative in a very specific way. Its role is to discourage disruption, not to cultivate trust. The presence of force becomes a constant reminder of boundaries, where people can gather, how loudly they can speak, how freely they can move. Over time, this creates a psychological environment where residents learn to associate authority with threat rather than support. Safety becomes conditional, something granted temporarily, not something guaranteed. This colonial framework explains why reform so often feels superficial. Farrakhan argues that you cannot redesign a system meant to control into one meant to protect simply by adjusting policies or language. The foundation remains the same. In colonies, enforcement exists to keep the colonized population from challenging the structure itself. When policing functions within that logic, moments of crisis reveal its priorities. Response is swift when order is disrupted, but slow when harm is suffered quietly, gradually, and without spectacle. What makes this reality especially difficult to confront is how normalized it has become. Children grow up seeing patrols as an everyday presence, not as guardians but as watchers. Adults learn which streets feel tense, which encounters require caution, which voices must be lowered. Farrakhan suggests that this constant negotiation drains communities emotionally and spiritually, producing exhaustion rather than rebellion. A tired population is easier to manage than an angry one. Within this structure, true safety becomes impossible, because safety cannot exist where trust is absent. Protection requires mutual responsibility, shared accountability, and a belief that human life is the highest priority. Farrakhan argues that when policing answers upward to distant authorities rather than outward to the community, that bond is broken. Decisions are guided by policy and pressure, not by relationship. The result is enforcement without empathy, presence without belonging. This is why Farrakhan does not frame the issue as individual behavior or isolated misconduct. He draws attention away from personalities and toward purpose. The question is not whether some officers mean well, but whether the system they serve was designed to preserve the well-being of the community or to manage it. In colonial systems, even good intentions are constrained by the role itself. You can soften the tone, but the function remains unchanged. By naming black neighborhoods as colonies, Farrakhan is not diminishing their resilience. He is highlighting their endurance. Colonies survive despite extraction, surveillance, and imposed order. They develop culture, creativity, and strength under pressure. But survival, he argues, is not the same as freedom. As long as safety depends on institutions that do not share the community's fate, it remains fragile and conditional. In this part of the story, Farrakhan is not simply criticizing policing. He is exposing a deeper contradiction. A people expected to feel protected by a system that was never built to prioritize their protection. Until that contradiction is resolved, safety remains an illusion visible from a distance, promised in theory, but unreachable in lived experience. After diagnosing the system and naming the colonial structure that defines it, Farrakhan does not linger in critique. He moves deliberately toward solution, not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical necessity. If external institutions were never designed to serve the people they oversee, then expecting liberation from them becomes a contradiction. In Farrakhan's view, the only logical response is self-determination, not as isolation, but as responsibility reclaimed. He frames self-determination as a shift in posture, from waiting to acting, from appealing upward to organizing inward. Security, justice, education, and leadership, he argues, must grow out of the community itself, because accountability only works when those who hold power share the same risks as those they serve, when leaders live among the people, when decision-makers drink the same water, walk the same streets, and send their children to the same schools. Responsibility becomes personal rather than procedural. In this vision, community-controlled security is not about fear or dominance. It is about familiarity. Protection begins with knowing who belongs, understanding local dynamics, and responding to conflict before it escalates. Farrakhan emphasizes that order does not require oppression, and discipline does not require dehumanization. A community that protects itself does so not through constant force, but through shared standards and mutual respect, where accountability is firm but rooted in care rather than distance. Justice, in this framework, is no longer something delivered from afar. It becomes a living process shaped by those most affected by its outcomes. Farrakhan suggests that when justice is disconnected from community values, it drifts toward punishment for its own sake. But when it is anchored locally, it can prioritize restoration, mediation, and responsibility. Wrongdoing is addressed without destroying futures, and consequences are designed to heal rather than simply remove. Education plays a central role in sustaining this independence. Farrakhan speaks of education not merely as schooling, but as orientation. What children are taught to value, what histories they inherit, and what futures they imagine all shape the limits of possibility. A self-determined community educates its youth to understand their worth, their history, and their capacity to build, not just to comply. Knowledge becomes preparation for stewardship rather than competition for approval. Leadership, then, emerges not from status but from service. Farrakhan rejects the idea of leaders as distant figures elevated above scrutiny. Instead, leadership is defined by accountability, by the willingness to be corrected, challenged, and, if necessary, replaced. Power is not owned by individuals, but entrusted by the collective. When leadership fails, the consequences are immediate and visible, not buried in layers of bureaucracy. What ties all of this together is responsibility. Farrakhan does not present self-determination as comfort or ease. He presents it as weight. To govern oneself is to remove excuses. There is no longer an external authority to blame or petition. Success and failure both belong to the people. This, he argues, is why self-determination is often resisted, not only by those in power, but by those who have grown accustomed to dependency disguised as protection. Yet Farrakhan insists that dignity cannot exist without ownership of one's destiny. Systems built without community consent will always prioritize order over humanity. Only when people govern the structures that shape their lives can safety, justice, and progress align. Self-determination, in this sense, is not rebellion. It is maturation. In the unfolding story, this solution does not erase struggle or guarantee peace. What it offers is alignment. When security, justice, education, and leadership answer directly to the people, the gap between survival and sovereignty begins to close. Farrakhan's message here is not that freedom is promised, but that it is possible, and that possibility begins the moment responsibility is no longer outsourced. With self-determination defined as responsibility reclaimed, Farrakhan moves to the force that makes such responsibility possible. Unity, not the kind that exists in slogans, moments of emotion, or brief displays of agreement, but a unity that is deliberate, organized, and disciplined. He argues that entrenched power has never been threatened by noise alone. It has endured outrage, absorbed protest, conciliation, and waited out moments of public attention. What it cannot easily withstand is coordination. Farrakhan frames unity as infrastructure rather than sentiment. It is not about everyone thinking the same way or erasing difference. It is about alignment around shared interests and shared consequences. When people act together economically, politically, and socially, power no longer flows in one direction. Decisions begin to carry weight, not because they are loud, but because they are backed by numbers, resources, and commitment. He explains that symbolic protest often operates within boundaries that power already understands how to manage. Marches end. Hashtags fade. Statements are acknowledged without being acted upon. These expressions may raise awareness, but they do not disrupt control. Strategic unity, on the other hand, changes behavior. It alters where money is spent, how votes are cast, who is supported, and who is held accountable. That is why, Farrakhan argues, self-sufficiency, it is treated as dangerous throughout history. So here, power has relied on division as its most reliable defense. Differences in class, belief, background, and identity are emphasized not to celebrate individuality, but to prevent collective movement. Farrakhan points out that a divided population does not need to be controlled aggressively. It will police itself through competition, suspicion, and internal conflict. Unity removes that advantage. It transforms scattered individuals into a coordinated presence that cannot be easily ignored or dismissed. In this framework, unity is not reactive. It is planned. It requires discipline, patience, and the willingness to prioritize long-term outcomes over short-term recognition. Farrakhan stresses that real unity does not chase approval or validation. It builds quietly, focusing on structure rather than spectacle. When economic decisions are made together, when political leverage is exercised collectively, and when leadership is chosen through shared criteria, power begins to shift without announcement. What makes this unity especially threatening is its permanence. Protests can be dispersed, messages can be reframed, and movements can be distracted. But organized unity embeds itself into daily life. It influences where people work, where they invest, how they educate their children, and how they respond to challenges. It becomes a constant presence rather than a temporary interruption. Farrakhan also emphasizes that disciplined unity requires restraint. Acting together does not mean acting impulsively. It means understanding timing, strategy, and consequence. Power expects emotional reactions. It prepares for them. What it struggles to counter is consistency. When people remain aligned despite pressure, criticism, or delay, the usual tactics lose effectiveness. This is why Farrakhan insists that unity must extend beyond moments of crisis. It cannot exist only when harm is visible or outrage is fresh. It must operate during calm periods, shaping systems before emergencies arise. Economic coordination. Political organization. This is one session. and cultural alignment are not responses to injustice. They are safeguards against it. In tying unity back to self-determination, Farrakhan presents it as the bridge between vision and reality. Independent systems cannot survive without collective support, and leadership cannot remain accountable without shared standards. Unity provides the framework that keeps power rooted in the people rather than drifting upward and away. In the larger story, this idea reframes strength. Strength is not measured by volume or confrontation, but by cohesion. Farrakhan's message suggests that when unity becomes disciplined and strategic, it no longer needs permission to matter. It reshapes the landscape quietly, steadily, and decisively, shifting control not through force, but through alignment that power can neither divide nor ignore. At the end of Farrakhan's argument, everything comes back to one unavoidable truth. Freedom cannot exist without control over survival. Ideas, protests, and even political influence mean very little if a people remain dependent on systems that can be withdrawn, manipulated, or weaponized against them. True liberation, he concludes, begins with ownership of the essentials: food, water, land, and financial institutions, because whoever controls these controls the future. He frames this not as theory, but as reality. A community that cannot feed itself is always one crisis away from collapse. Grocery shelves owned by outsiders can empty overnight. Prices can rise without warning. Quality can be lowered without consequence. When food is imported into a neighborhood rather than grown, processed, and distributed from within, dependence becomes normalized. Farrakhan argues that this dependence is not accidental. It keeps communities focused on survival instead of sovereignty. Owning food production, even on a small scale, shifts power immediately. The moment people can feed themselves, they negotiate from strength, not desperation. Water follows the same logic. Clean water is life itself. Yet history has shown how easily access can be neglected, delayed, or politicized. So Farrakhan's message is simple and unsettling. If someone else controls your water, they control your health, your time, and your future. Ownership here is not about luxury or excess, but about protection. When communities safeguard their own water sources and infrastructure, survival is no longer a permission granted by distant authorities. Land, too, becomes central. Without land, everything else is temporary. Businesses, rent. Homes feel conditional. Institutions remain vulnerable. Farrakhan emphasizes that land anchors independence. It allows communities to build, grow, and plan beyond the next election cycle or policy shift. Land transforms presence into permanence. It turns survival into continuity. Financial institutions complete the structure. Money, in Farrakhan's view, is not just currency. It is direction. When earnings flow out of a community as quickly as they come in, labor enriches others while leaving little behind. Banks that do not belong to the people they serve decide who receives opportunity and who waits indefinitely. Ownership of financial systems allows communities to invest in their own priorities: education, health, housing, and innovation without begging for access or approval. Taken together, these essentials form the foundation of real freedom. Farrakhan is clear that this is not about separation or hostility. It is about balance. Independence does not reject cooperation. It makes cooperation fair. When a people can sustain themselves, partnership becomes a choice rather than a necessity born of weakness. This is where the story closes. Not with anger, not with fear, but with responsibility. Farrakhan's conclusion is that liberation is not a gift that arrives through speeches or promises. It is built patiently and deliberately, through control of what keeps a people alive. Without that control, freedom remains symbolic. With it, dignity becomes practical. Thank you for taking the time to listen and engage with this story. If this perspective made you think, challenged assumptions, or added depth to your understanding, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep conversations like this alive, visible, and ongoing. Alive, visible, and ongoing. Alive.